What I'll be talking about is emotional intelligence. This is something I've been researching since the year 2000 in various ways. Tonight I'm going to focus on whether there is actually a factual basis for all these claims that are being bandied around about how fantastic emotional intelligence is, or whether it's just some hyped up fad. So I'll be going through, firstly, the popularity of emotional intelligence. I'll talk about how it came to be so popular so quickly. I'll also talk about why I think emotional intelligence gained such traction in the business world, in human resources, and in various other spheres. Why I think that in the late 1990s the public were really ripe for understanding and just embracing this concept. I'll also talk about some of the consequences that this rapid rise to popularity had for emotional intelligence, both in terms of the public perception of EI, or emotional intelligence, and in terms of how the research proceeded. I'll finally get to a definition of what it is. Normally in a talk this would be the first thing you do, but for various reasons there's hundreds and hundreds of definitions, and to get to the point where I state the one that's commonly accepted, we have to go through a few things first. Now, the main thing I want to be the takeaway message is the evaluation of a major early claim about emotional intelligence. There's this claim that emotional intelligence is much more important than IQ. This is still in existence on some companies' websites, some companies that are promoting their emotional intelligence products, and we finally have enough of a research base to evaluate this. I'll also talk about what I think emotional intelligence is useful for, some new directions in the measurement and assessment of emotional intelligence, and then I'll summarise whether I believe it is fact or fad. So the rise to popularity was very rapid. The first mention of emotional intelligence in a psychological academic journal was in 1990 by authors John Mayer, Maria Di Paolo and Peter Salovey. So they defined emotional intelligence as the ability to monitor one's own and others' feelings and emotions, to discriminate among these emotions, and then to use this emotional information to guide one's thinking and actions. So monitoring one's own emotions means being aware of whether one's feeling sad or whether it's actually gone full-blown into depression, to understand the difference between feeling anxious and feeling depressed, and to the monitoring others' feelings and emotions involves the ability to actually perceive how they're feeling. So to tell what emotions they're experiencing based on facial expressions, posture, body language, or tone of voice. Then there's the ability to discriminate among these feelings. So for example, to know the difference between different feelings. And the basis, I think, of emotional intelligence is to use this emotional information. So they're positing that emotional information has adaptive value and can be used to make non-emotional decisions. So this is generally held to be the first journal article where emotional intelligence was mentioned in 1990. But if you scan the literature really, really closely and put it under a magnifying glass, you'll find a much earlier passing reference in 1966. I'm only going to mention this because I think it's funny. And the journal that mentioned it was a German academic journal, and the author of this journal article proposed that certain women were unable to accept their social roles due to mother attachment, and they were unable to do this because they had low emotional intelligence. So that's not the funny part. The funny part is his proposed solution. His proposed solution was that they be treated with a brand new and exciting pharmaceutical at the time. He proposed giving them LSD. So the first mention of emotional intelligence, there was controversy already, even in the swinging 60s. But these journal articles, they really didn't have no one really cared. No one really cares what we do in these obscure journal articles. But once you get a book in the popular press, people really start to pay attention. And this book by psychologist Daniel Goleman came out in 1995. It was a #1 bestseller. The title is Emotional Intelligence, Why It Can Matter More Than IQ. So this book really launched a public interest in emotional intelligence. Up until then, it was a fairly obscure research topic that a handful of academics were interested in. After this book came out, it appeared on Oprah Winfrey, it was on the cover of Time magazine. Emotional intelligence was voted one of the most useful new phrases by the American Dialectical Society, and it just took off. I mean, there were really a lot of businesses and human resources consultants who started using this term, who started really embracing the concept of emotional intelligence. And this is the basis. It's this book. This book was not based on empirical studies of emotional intelligence because there were no tests of it at the time. There was no way of doing research on it. Instead, what Goleman did was come up with some broad ideas about how he thought that a range of emotional skills could be a lot more important for success in life than the IQ or intelligence quotient. So this is broad ideas based on a diverse range of findings from social psychology, from some brain research, from educational psychology and from business. But there wasn't actually any empirical studies of emotional intelligence that went into this book. So given that there was actually no real evidence that emotional intelligence really did anything, why did it become so popular so quickly? One of the things I think that you have to understand was what was going on in psychological testing in the mid to late 1990s. And the biggest controversy at the time was a book called The Bell Curve. So I've got a reference to The Bell Curve here. It's by Herrnstein and Murray, called The Bell Curve: Intelligence and Class Structure in American Life. So what this book proposed was that group differences between African American and white people in America, in their IQ, explained different levels of success between white Americans and African Americans. So it's been known for a while, there's a large body of evidence that, as illustrated in this graph, white Americans tend to score, on average, 15 IQ points higher than African Americans. There's also a lot of overlap, but the mean between, African Americans and white Americans, but the mean tends to be higher. The average score is higher for white people. Why the bell curve was controversial was not simply stating this difference, but positing that it was probably genetic in origin, probably unchangeable through training, and was responsible for different rates of success, so different rates of college completion, incarceration, average earnings between these different races. So this was very controversial, as you might imagine. It was a bit of a bombshell. People really wanted to distance themselves from intelligence and IQ testing and get away from these old bossy white racist guys. No one wanted to be all about IQ testing. So the public was really ripe for believing in alternative explanations for success. They were really looking for an alternative to the intelligence quotient to explain success in life. And emotional intelligence, particularly as conceptualised by Goleman, was posited as an alternative. So this becomes even more obvious when you think about the way that it's often referred to as EQ, your emotion quotient, and held in stark contrast to IQ, your intelligence quotient. So we have in this sort of popular conception of emotional intelligence the idea that it is somehow very, very different from IQ, that it's contrasts with IQ and it's a better explanation for why people succeed and a more palatable explanation for why people succeed in life. So that's one of the reasons I think that emotional intelligence had this rapid rise within a year or two to being extremely popular and in extremely high use. And the field was really, there were a lot of effects of the fact that it just became popular so quickly. Firstly, on the way that the public saw EI, the public perception of EI, and secondly, in the way that the research community started to look at it. So one of the problems was that people were so enthusiastic about emotional intelligence that they really wanted to start using these training programs and tests and other things straight away before there was any research base that it was any good, before there were any validated tests that showed that emotional intelligence was important. So they used whatever was there. These business practitioners and consultants, even though they had yet no evidence base. There was also no evidence base for several claims that were bandied around as true. And one of the most important and most often repeated claims was that emotional intelligence is more important than IQ. So this was basically held to be true for a while and is still appearing on many websites of people who are promoting their emotional intelligence products. So there's this claim that abounds, but is it in fact true? We didn't know in the mid to late 1990s. So there was, as a consequence of this massive popularity, also a backlash against emotional intelligence. If it's everywhere as a hyped up buzzword, if everyone's so enthusiastic and they're all talking about different things, there's a perception that this is just a fad, this is a hyped up fad, this is nonsense. And I think this is illustrated by this Dilbert cartoon. I like Dilbert, so I thought I'd put this up here. So we've got Dogbert, the little dog character, saying, "Don't mind the stopwatch, I'm testing my theory that people get dumber every minute." And Dilbert says, "It's not so simple, Dogbert. You'll also have to consider my emotional intelligence, which is defined in a book I haven't read." 12 seconds, says Dogbert. So this really illustrates the idea that a lot of people are viewing emotional intelligence as this empty executive buzzword, and also that there's a lot of claims floating around about what emotional intelligence is, and also a lot of people that haven't read any sort of definition in any sort of reputable book about what this is. It just has a protean sort of meaning. So quite apart from the public perception of EI and industry use of EI, there's also effects on the research community of this really rapid rise to popularity. And one of the things that happened was researchers are just like everyone else. Once it became so much in the public eye, a lot of research teams started to take an interest in it and decide that they would research this. And they all started at the same time. So this research began with a number of teams working in parallel so that their research didn't inform each other. There were different teams in different places who were saying, I'm going to study EI and I'm going to define it like this and measure it like this. And that could be completely different to another research team and the way that they were defining and measuring the concept. So there were a lot of people defining and measuring emotional intelligence in a lot of different ways. This caused great confusion because people could claim that emotional intelligence was this or that, and it could be a completely different claim or definition to another team. So in an effort to end this confusion, there were a few researchers that started to look at the similarities and differences that different teams' conceptualisations of EI had, and they said, okay, there basically seems to be two major trends. There's two major ways that people are defining and measuring emotional intelligence. Some of them are doing it through these mixed models, and some of them are doing it through these ability models. So the mixed models are defining emotional intelligence as a mix of a bunch of things, as character, motivation, emotional skills, social competencies, and various other things. So they're a very broad definition of a number of different types of constructs. Whereas the ability models held that emotional intelligence was purely an ability. So it's just like, for example, musical ability, numerical ability or mathematic ability, except that you're dealing with emotions instead of music or numbers or mathematical equations. So they're two very, very different ways of conceptualising emotional intelligence. So when you are reviewing the research literature and you hear a claim, emotional intelligence predicts, marital dysfunction, you really need to figure out which kind of emotional intelligence they're talking about, because these two things, they don't even relate to each other, these mixed models and ability models. And they're measured differently. So mixed model tests of emotional intelligence tend to use these rating scales. So I've got here an example of some emotional intelligence test items from Nicola Schutte's emotional intelligence test. She's a researcher based in Australia, and her test came out in 1998. So we have here an item: I know when to speak about my personal problems to others. To strongly disagree, to strongly agree. I find it hard to understand the non-verbal messages of other people. That might be another item, or I know why my emotions change. So there are a large number of tests of this kind. Probably the most well-known, which came out the earliest, is Baron's emotional quotient inventory. There's also something called the TQ, the Trait Emotional Intelligence Questionnaire. There's a measure called GENOS that came out of a group at Swinburne University in Melbourne. There's Daniel Goleman's Emotional Competency Inventory. There's something called the Wong-Law Scale by Wong and Law that's often used in the business world. And there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of others. So there really are literally hundreds of these rating scales around, and they're all slightly different. Measuring emotional intelligence as an ability model is a bit different. So normally you have some sort of question where you're asking people, can you recognise or evaluate the emotion present in some sort of stimulus? So this is an example of trying to test whether people can recognise the emotion in a facial expression. And this face is my baby son when he's a couple of weeks old. So we're deciding whether the extent to which he feels or expresses happiness, fear and sadness in this picture. So if I look at that, I don't think he's really looking happy at all, unfortunately. So I would maybe rate that a 1 for no happiness. He does look a little bit scared of the world there. The world's a very scary place when you're only a couple of weeks old, so maybe that's a 3. I don't think he looks sad. I think he looks fine. So this is an example of the type of test item that you would have for an ability EI model. And unlike the mixed models, there's actually only one commercially available test. That's the Mesquite, the Mayer-Salavi-Caruso Emotional Intelligence Test. So these are very different, these mixed models and these ability models. And I'll just go through some of the differences between these two kinds of emotional intelligence in the research literature. So mixed models are also known as self-report emotional intelligence, self-estimated emotional intelligence, trait emotional intelligence, and personality emotional intelligence. Ability models have a lot of names as well: ability-based emotional intelligence, information processing emotional intelligence, or objective emotional intelligence. As we saw on the previous slide, mixed model tests tend to use rating scales as their items, whereas ability model tests tend to use items where the test taker has to make some sort of judgment or evaluation of a test stimulus. Mixed model test scores tend to be strongly related to well-known personality traits. In particular, they relate to the personality trait emotional stability. So people who are high on emotional stability would very rarely feel depressed, anxious, or vulnerable to stress, and they'd be very quick to get over those sorts of feelings. So these mixed model tests of emotional intelligence show a really strong relationship with those personality traits. So strong that it's been argued that they're actually just measuring these existing personality traits, that what we've got is a relabeling of existing traits rather than measuring a new construct, emotional intelligence. So they can also relate to the personality trait extraversion. So being extroverted means you tend to enjoy the company of others, you tend to feel positive emotions, and you tend to have a lot of energy. So these are very strongly related to those existing constructs in psychology. The tests tend to be really quick and easy to administer, that's why there's a huge number of them, but they also tend to have fairly transparent items that are easy to fake. So what I mean by this is, say there's a very common scenario when these tests are used. You're going through a job application process and you have to do a battery of psychological tests as part of that application. You come across the item, as on the previous page, I know when to speak about my personal problems to others. Even if you pretty much know that you'll tell anyone your life sob story, you're going, you know, they probably won't give me the job if I say that. I might say yes. Yes, I always know when to tell people my personal information about my emotions. So this is a bit of a problem for these types of rating scales, and there are a few ways that psychologists and human resources consultants try and get around this transparency, but it is an issue. It is a bit of an issue for these types of scales. Whereas ability models, unlike the mixed models, the tests don't relate very strongly to personality, so they're clearly measuring something different from what we already know about in psychology. They do tend to relate to intelligence. So remember I said earlier that, at least in the popular conceptualisation that grew out of Goleman's book, emotional intelligence was held to be something completely different from standard types of intelligence. This is not really the case when you measure it as the ability to process emotions. These tests, they tend to relate to the knowledge part of intelligence rather than the reasoning part of intelligence. So we might propose that these tests are measuring knowledge in a particular domain, and that domain is knowledge of emotions and social stimuli. However, the relationship to these intelligence tests is not as strong as the relationship between personality and mixed model tests of emotional intelligence. They are actually clearly separate from existing IQ measures. So we've got something new here. We're measuring some sort of knowledge about how emotions work. However, these tests, or rather the test, the Mesquite, there's no other commercially available ones, it's really a pain in the neck to administer. So the Mesquite takes between 40 minutes and an hour for a person to do, and the scoring is very complex and has to be done by the company that owns the test, Multi Health Systems. It's not very transparent how they score the tests. There's very few tests available. As I said, the Mesquite is the only one really, but it does depend on knowledge. You can't increase your score just because you want to. If you really can't see the emotions expressed in someone's facial expressions, you can guess the answer, but you can't increase your score to a higher level than you can actually see, than you can actually perceive. So these are the two emotional intelligences. Now, as I said, there were many, many different definitions. Each of the different research teams who started working on emotional intelligence in the late 90s came up with their own definition. We've coalesced at this point so that most people are now using this particular definition of emotional intelligence, the four-branch hierarchical model of emotional intelligence proposed by these three guys: John Mayer, at the University of New Hampshire, Peter Salovey at Yale, and David Caruso in the world of business, who does his own consultancy work, has a consultancy. So they proposed this definition in a series of articles in the 1990s, and the definition is basically based on this picture here. So they're proposing that there's four related sets of competencies, which they call branches, which range from the very simple types of skills, like being able to read someone's facial expression in terms of emotion, to the very complicated or complex sorts of skills, like being able to reflectively regulate or manage your emotions. So I'll just go briefly through how they define these 4 sets of competencies, these 4 branches. So at the very bottom is the perception and expression of emotion. This is branch 1. So this relates to things like, as I said, being able to recognise the emotions that other people are expressing through their facial expressions, through their tone of voice, through their body language and so on. So you really want to be able to know whether someone's being sarcastic or not from their tone. This is a useful skill. The second branch is this assimilating emotions in thought. So there's 2 aspects to this. The first one is knowledge of what kind of emotions might be useful to feel in different kinds of situations, different kinds of non-emotional tasks. So for example, if you are about to go into an exam room, you might want to know that it's best not to feel horribly anxious. It might be best also to have a sort of flat emotional affect and not to be really excited and bouncing off the walls and wanting to chat with people. So that's the first component to this second branch. The second component is actually being able to do it. So it's all very well to say, okay, I know that it's useful for me to be sort of calm and quiet, but I can't control myself. I'm bouncing off the walls and I'm really anxious. So there's 2 very different components to that branch. And together these 2 branches are known as experiential or experience-based emotional intelligence. The third branch is the understanding of emotions. So this is your knowledge about emotions as a source of information, how emotions relate to each other, how they relate to situations. So you might know that a loss will usually result in the feeling of sadness. And finally, there's this reflective regulation or management of emotions. So this is being able to manage an emotional situation to gain the best possible outcome. So for example, if you've gone out to dinner with friends and the friends start to have a big domestic at the dinner table, if you know what to do to bring things back to an even keel in that situation, that's your emotion management ability. That's your reflective regulation of emotions. So together these 2 higher branches are referred to as strategic emotional intelligence because they involve implementing strategies to get to what you want. So these 3 guys, they propose that emotional intelligence is an ability. So they're proposing that it actually is pretty much a part of intelligence. It's a specific part. It should relate to other kinds of abilities and it should show developmental progression. So it should get better from childhood to adolescence to adulthood. And as I said, there's 2 tests that measure this. Well, actually I said there was 1. And then there is the precursor that was used only for research. So the Mesquite, the Mayer-Salovey-Caruso emotional intelligence test, that's the commercially available one, and the MEIS, the multi-factor emotional intelligence scale, was used to generate a lot of research. So I'm finally getting to what I hope is really the guts of this presentation today, and that's evaluating some early claims about emotional intelligence. And one of the major claims is that emotional intelligence is in fact more important than IQ for job performance. At the time when this was first commonly believed, there was no research base to evaluate whether it was true. Now there is. We now have enough research so that this can be summarised with a statistical technique called meta-analysis, which is just a way of summarising different papers, different research findings. So what do the results say? So we know from a meta-analysis by Schmidt and Hunter in 1998, shown here in red, that if we know the differences between people in their IQ, we can explain 25% of the differences in their job performance. So differences in IQ can account for about a quarter of the difference in job performance. So they made this estimate based on 32,000 people doing 515 kinds of jobs. So how does emotional intelligence compare to that? We don't have 32,000 people. We have 562 people available to make an estimate about this based on 8 studies. And Dana Joseph and Dan Newman, in that green reference there, they summarised this literature. Here it is. Emotional intelligence explains approximately 3% of the differences in how people perform on their jobs. But wait, you might be thinking, some jobs really don't require much human interaction. Like, there really are jobs where there's just some slob sitting in the back room doing technical stuff, never client-facing, questionable personal hygiene. These people, emotional intelligence is not going to affect how they do their work. And this is something that Dana and Dan considered. So they split the jobs out into those kinds of jobs where, in fact, expressing positive emotions was part of the job. This is referred to as a high emotion labour job, where compared to those kind of jobs where you really it doesn't matter what emotion you express at work. And these are low emotional labour jobs. So when we look at that, we'll see that for these slobs in the back room, there's absolutely no relationship. I can't even see a coloured bar there between emotional intelligence and their performance at work. For the people in high emotion labour jobs, those that have to have service with a smile or something like that, emotional intelligence can explain about 7% of the differences in job performance. However, is emotional intelligence more important than IQ for job performance? No. It's clearly not. And the reason why I harp on this point so much is there's still so many websites that make this claim, that it's still very much in the popular press, and it's just not true. However, moving on, given that this claim is false, is emotional intelligence just a bunch of crap? Is it a fad? I don't think so. I think it's useful for a couple of reasons, which I'll outline. The first one is, even though it looks kind of not great next to intelligence on that graph, explaining 7% of performance is non-trivial. If I can increase my efficiency by 7%, that's equivalent to an additional 3 or 4 weeks per year of work. I can do a lot in an additional 3 weeks of work. I can sell a lot more widgets, or in my field, I can publish a lot more papers if I've got 3 extra weeks to do it in. So 7% is non-trivial. We're all obsessed with saying it has to be better than intelligence. I think it just has to be useful. The second reason why I think this 7% is non-trivial is that there's a lot of complex jobs out there where there really are very little difference between people in terms of IQ. So these are jobs where everyone has to be smart just to do the jobs. When there are no differences between people in IQ, pretty much, then you can't explain differences in their job performance in terms of differences in their IQ, because there are none. And these jobs, other things explain job performance. So for example, in a job where everybody's smart, but some people are actually also able to carry on a conversation and smile at people and be reasonable in terms of social skills as a manager, they're going to do a lot better, even though they're just as smart. So for jobs where there are no differences in IQ, where that 25% just disappears, you still need other things to explain differences in job performance. The second thing that I wanted to get to is possibly a controversial statement to make while my boss is in the audience, but job performance is not the be-all and end-all. It's not the most important thing in life. Most people are also interested in outcomes in their personal life, like being able to cope with stress and feeling happy and self-fulfilled. So emotional intelligence does a better job at explaining these things than it does at explaining job performance. So in my research, I've found that differences in emotional intelligence, specifically in emotion management, explain 10 to 15% of the differences in how well people can cope with stress. Also, differences in emotional intelligence, again in that highest branch, emotion management, can explain nearly 1/3 of the differences in well-being. And I've specified that this is eudaimonic well-being, which is the type of well-being associated with optimum psychological function, reaching your goals. So not just being generally happy, but feeling that you're sort of self-actualised, that you're going somewhere. And this is important. So before I summarise, I wanted to talk about some of the new directions in emotional intelligence. So I've kept saying that there's only one test out there commercially available, and that's the Mesquite, the Mayer-Salovey-Caruso Emotional Intelligence Test. But there's a few things in the hopper that may come out in the next few years. One of them is these tasks from the emotion recognition ability literature. So here's an example from Tanya Banziger and colleagues at the Swiss Centre for Affective Sciences. So they measure how well people can recognise emotions from facial expressions, vocal expressions and body language. And here I've got some examples of test items looking at whether you can recognise emotions purely from tone of voice. So there's someone who just simply talks nonsense syllables but does so in a particular emotional tone. So you're ready to test your emotion recognition ability? Here we go. What do you think of these emotions? Yes. Yes, it is fear. Very bold. So what do we think that is? Yeah, it's anger. It sounds a bit irritable. So another area where emotion recognition ability studies have come up with ways to measure these sorts of abilities is Paul Ekman's work on facial expression recognition. So there's a task called the Japanese and Caucasian Brief Affect Recognition Test. This is based on testing whether you can recognise micro-expressions of emotion. So micro-expressions occur when someone's trying to hide how they really feel, but they let a little bit of information leak out. And this is known as emotional leakage. So one of the ways that these emotional expressions leak out is through these micro-expressions. So you might feel really angry and try and control it on your face, but you'll let out a micro-expression of anger. So being able to recognise these micro-expressions can be very important to understanding how someone really feels. And Paul Ekman's starting to build a little bit of an empire around this in terms of training tools. And this sort of research is also the loose basis for the television program Lie to Me. So I'm just going to show you some examples now, and hopefully the technology works, of whether you can recognise these micro-expressions. So let's have a look. So what do we think? He's kind of angry. Let's have a look at this one. So she was actually happy. So there's a lot of research going on into better ways to measure emotional intelligence, which will eventually trickle into public use, I think. One of the other areas where there's research going on right now is situational judgment tests. So using a situational judgment test is an example of trying to put a situation or situate these emotional skills into some sort of relevant context. So I've done some work developing some of these to test emotion management, and this is what a situational test of emotion management might look like. So we've got a scenario and 4 ways to deal with the scenario. These can be video-based or they can be just black and white. So here in this scenario, we've got a demanding client taking up a lot of Jill's time and then asking to speak to her boss about her performance. Although Jill's boss assures her that her performance is fine, Jill feels upset. What action would be the most effective for Jill? So she could talk to her friends or workmates about it. She could ignore the incident and move on to her next task. She could calm down by taking deep breaths and going for a short walk. Or she could think that she's been successful in the past and this client being difficult is not her fault. So the best answer is D, is using this technique of reappraisal to cope with this stressful situation. So these are some new directions. The field is continuing, but I did want to get to the point where I could actually answer the question that I started this talk with. Is emotional intelligence fact or fad? And the unexciting answer is that it's at neither extreme. The truth is out there. The truth is in the middle, as it is for most things. It's certainly not the cure-all elixir that earlier claims suggest. It's not more important than intelligence for job performance, as is still suggested in various forums, particularly outside of academia for people in their consultancies. Although emotional intelligence predicts job performance, it does so really for emotion-related jobs only, and it does predict emotion-related outcomes. So this is a useful set of skills to consider when you're considering emotion-related outcomes, but you can't just apply it all over the place. So my conclusion is, let's throw the bathwater out, all these early claims which are way over the top, but let's keep the baby.
One difference I perceive between intelligence quotients and emotional intelligence, or perhaps cognitive intelligence and emotional intelligence, is that although with practice you can get better at IQ tests, you don't actually improve your intelligence. Your intelligence doesn't go up very much. Is that also the case with emotional intelligence, or can we learn, can we be trained, can we be conditioned in such a way that our emotional intelligence goes up over time?
That's a complicated two-part question, and I'll answer the two parts. The claim that you don't actually get smarter, you just get better at IQ tests is contentious. I mean, there's a lot of research going on that suggests that there's particular training programs that do make you smarter, not at a range of tasks, not just at particular tests. And I think it's a similar answer, that there's evidence that there are training programs in place that will make you better at the component skills involved in emotional intelligence, but there's still that chicken and egg question that you referred to. Are you actually getting better at emotional intelligence as a construct, or are you just getting better at taking the test? So I mentioned some of Paul Ekman's training tasks at teaching people to recognise micro-expressions. Certainly you can get better at doing that. If you do it enough times in practice, you get better at it. But the question remains as to whether you're just getting better at that very specific task that is tested, or whether all of your abilities are increased. It's difficult to tell.
Now, with the emotional intelligence, like, all humans have emotions, so then of course we have the different levels. Now, with the productivity side, would we better not have any emotions at all for a better outcome business related wise?
No. I will elaborate on that. But it obviously depends vastly on the job. But I mean, if you don't have any emotions at all, if you completely don't see any emotions that other people are experiencing, you miss a lot of information, particularly if you're in the sort of client-focused role where you're trying to get people to buy stuff. You need to have those cues as to when they're about to cave in and, buy it, or whether they're feeling genuinely anxious. Those sorts of cues are important. Even for there's some research going on into how emotional intelligence is important for dealing with people who are trying to get their superannuation out now that there's been this global financial crisis, and you do need to be able to read people's emotions to determine, how anxious they are and what advice you should give them. So, yeah, it's not better to have none at all. You miss information.
25% of our job performance is determined by intelligence. 7% is determined by emotional intelligence. What about the other 40-odd%? What's that determined by?
I'm really sorry, I didn't hear that question.
The question is about the other percentage that you didn't account for. So for job performance, 25%, 7%, and then you didn't account for the rest.
So the major other contributor to job performance is the personality trait conscientiousness, which accounts for an additional 10% of the variation in job performance. So there's various other things that account for small percentages, but there's actually just a lot of stuff that we can't account for, that we can't explain 100% of job performance. So that's the other major one. Of course, the amount of training and education can explain job performance. A positive environment can explain job performance, but the major other contributor is conscientiousness, how hard you work.
I do feel that I can often read the emotions of people, but my problem is with the measurements of both things. Perhaps I'm just an exception to the rule, but as far as emotional intelligence is concerned, I'm always being misread. I make so many statements which are neutral, and they're always, well, not always, but so often taken as criticisms. So I feel that the measurements of people, as far as me is concerned, is wrong. But more worrying still is the IQ tests, because we had them in schools when I was there in the early 50s in primary schools. We had to do these IQ tests to decide whether you went to selective schools or not. That's what was around in those days. Now, although I was in the top of the primary schools, in the top group, I missed out on going to a selective school. My IQ was too low. So I went to an intermediate high, and then after that we were allowed to go on to a senior high school for the leaving certificate. And consequently, I've got 4 degrees, including a doctorate, plus lots of other qualifications. So I just have no faith in the IQ measurement at all.
Yeah, there's a lot of scepticism out there, and there's a lot besides the intelligence that you're born with or the intelligence that you can potentially achieve that goes into your score. And that's maybe something I should elaborate on in terms of the bell curve, because the environment that you come from and the opportunities that you have can influence your IQ scores enormously. If you're in an impoverished environment, that is going to affect your score. It is going to be lower. These things are not independent of environmental influences. Now, I don't know in your particular case what happened, but certainly you can't use IQ scores to completely determine someone's potential, irrespective of their starting point or the environment that they're in. That would just be complete misuse of the tests. In terms of being misread, it's very hard to comment on a specific incident or a specific situation, but it does sound like that there might be a problem with the expression of emotion, or there might be a problem with cultural norms. That's another area where this research can be quite problematic, is in emotional intelligence, because a lot of emotional expression is culturally prescribed. So what you get, which I can't believe is possibly true, is when you transport the mesquite from America, which is where it was developed and where all the scoring procedures were developed, and put it in Australia, we're not as emotionally intelligent as the Americans. And I just can't believe that that's true. I'm assuming that it's because there's parts of this that really are culturally relative.
Thank you. You've answered part of my question, because I'm going to ask about whether there was any gender or cultural bias. So would you like to address the first part, which is gender biasing?
It's one of the only areas of ability where women outscore men, and particularly on the management aspect. They're pretty much equal on the other 3 branches, but women tend to score higher on emotion management.
Hi, I just wanted to ask, what kind of correlations are there between IQ and EI? And also, when it comes to the variations between coping in stress and happiness and well-being, how much of that variation is explained by IQ?
in answer to your first question, I think that the meta-analytic estimates between emotional intelligence and various aspects of IQ show that there's about a 0.3 correlation, and it's not with fluid reasoning ability, it's with your crystallised or acculturated knowledge, your knowledge base, your knowledge rather than your reasoning. So that 0.3 is explaining 10%. In answer to how much of happiness is due to intelligence, I don't know from that study particularly, but I'm trying to think if there actually is a study that just looks at intelligence and happiness. So I couldn't tell you.
Just with those graphs that you were looking at from that meta study, is that using the same definition? Yeah.
Yeah, it is. So the graphs from the meta-analysis, from the Dan and Dana's meta-analysis, Joseph and Newman's meta-analysis, uses data from the Mesquite, so the 4-branch model. It's looking at EI as an ability, and that's using that definition. And in fact, the values are for the emotion management branch. That seems to be the most relevant one. The other 3 branches don't relate so much to job performance.
Okay. On that note, please join with me in thanking Carolyn for a really wonderful lecture.
This is Big Ideas from the ABC.